Welcome back, everyone. Before we dive in, make sure you drop your thoughts and the lessons you took from this story in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's get into it. My name is Elijah Moore. I grew up in Southside Chicago, learned how to fix my first computer at 14 in a community center class that smelled like old fries and bleach, and I built a life from those small, stubborn pieces. I run a modest IT support firm that helps neighborhood clinics and independent law offices keep their networks clean and their patient data private. It's steady work that pays the bills and leaves me with time on weekends to fix up my mother's porch or coach Little League. I married Simone Carter 3 years ago. She grew up in Uptown, trained as a dental hygienist, and later moved into corporate dental sales. We liked the same music, loved slow Sundays, and both came from families that valued grit over flash. When she got promoted last month, the office called it a well-earned step up. They congratulated her on the conference stage and poured champagne in the break room. That evening she stood on our balcony, phone still buzzing in her hand, and said, "I deserve that." I kissed her, proud and loud in the way a man who loves his woman loud should be. I didn't know then how fast that word deserved would start a wildfire between us. At first, marriage felt like that warm, top-of-the-pillow kind of peace. Simone could make the kitchen smell like Sundays, even on a Wednesday. She was precise in small domestic things, folding my shirts the way my grandmother had taught her once when we visited. She knew the names of my clients' kids and asked after old friends with a memory that made me feel seen. I admired her hustle. She worked late sometimes, traveled for clients, and talked about leadership pipelines and mentorship like a hymn. I praised her at barbecues, told my mom that I'd married someone who kept her word and her word was honest. We were a partnership on paper, or at least that's how I told myself the truth. Love made me generous. Responsibility made me prudent. When she whispered, "We can save for a house," I nodded and drafted budgets in my head. When she asked for help paying back a lingering medical bill from a year when she'd been between contracts, I cleared it. Love made it feel like the right investment. I didn't see the ledger she kept in the dark. The first time I noticed the small dark thread of something else was stupid and domestic. A receipt for a dinner I didn't remember, a lipstick stain on a shirt that wasn't mine, a sudden sniff of a cologne I couldn't place. I asked and she laughed it off, gave me a look that was half apology and half performance. "You worry too much," she said, fingers tracing my jaw like she was rehearsing a line. Later, when she got the promotion and the title change landed on her LinkedIn like an illuminated badge, the applause made me proud. But pride wears different clothes when you're the man who put your shoulders under someone else's climb. One afternoon we sat in the living room, and I asked how her day had been, and she answered in a way that still cracks me open. "It's good, babe. Feels like all the work finally paid off." I said, "You earned it," and meant it. She smiled, then, with a small, strange tilt to her mouth, she said, "It's more than that. It's time for me to get everything I deserve." That phrase lodged in me like a tag on a bleeding wound. The night she told me I was holding her back is the night the apartment learned the truth about us. She had just come home from a glossy event where she'd been introduced to executives from other regions. The house still smelled like the lemon cleaner I used on the counter, and I had on a worn tee because that's what I'd always found comforting. She walked in buzzing on praise and new offers. Her hair pulled into that tight bun she reserved for important meetings, and she dropped her bag and stood in the doorway like someone perched on a cliff. I asked, "How did it go?" And she said, cold and even, "I got what I needed." I felt proud for a second. Then she walked right up to me and said, "Elijah, you're holding me back from everything I deserve." The words swung like a door slammed hard. For a moment the room was all air and no sound. She meant it. She watched me shrink in the space between us and didn't flinch. I remember the exact way her vowels folded into that sentence, like she'd been practicing the cadence of it for weeks in a mirror where only ambition could see her. My chest went weird, like a fist squeezing a balloon. I asked her to repeat it, because you always ask someone who is publicly tearing you down to repeat themselves, as if repetition will reveal that it was a misfired joke. She did repeat it, softer this time, like an apology that stayed only in technique. "You're holding me back from everything I deserve." Her eyes didn't water. Her voice held no regret. She folded the apology into the sentence, like a present wrapped to make someone else feel foolish for believing in it. And if I'm honest, the worst part was how composed she was. No shame, no chaos, just the precise extraction of the narrative she wanted to live in. The woman standing there in a dress that hugged everything she wanted from life looked, in that moment, painted red with self-preservation and sharp lines. After she said it, I felt the old self, the man who gives the last dollar and expects a thank you, fall out of fashion in my body. I walked the house that night, collecting small evidence of our life like a man who had just discovered his home had been a stage set. There were texts from colleagues that made her laugh like they were private currencies, calendar invites she left open on the kitchen table that showed dinners with people whose names I'd never met. The thing that hurt most wasn't the presence of other men or the late nights. It was the recalibration of the story about us. I had always imagined our marriage as two people building something in tandem. Her phrasing of, "You're holding me back," recontextualized every loving act I'd done as a chain around her ankles. I replayed our earlier years, every sacrifice, wondering when being supportive had become symbolic handcuffs in her vocabulary. She did what people trained in charm do after they cut you loose. She apologized like she was caring for my ego rather than my heart. She said, "Elijah, I didn't mean it like that." And then she said, "I'm sorry if it hurt you." The apology was a lesson in manipulation because each line was structured to move me into guilt for her discomfort. She made sure to frame herself as the one suffering the conflict between ambition and tenderness. She leaned close when she said it, hands searching for skin that would accept her, as if proximity could rewrite words. I could smell the expensive lotion from the conference on her wrists. I could see the way her smile practiced forgiveness like a public relations manager rehearsing a release. I wanted to be outraged, to shout the unfairness into the night, but something quieter crept over me, a cold, meticulous clarity. I didn't explode. I did something worse for her pride. I watched and began a catalog. I started to keep record of the things she said and the things I did. I saved invoices, old emails where she'd asked for help, and messages where she'd promised, "I'll pay you back." I documented travel itineraries when she told me trips were work-related, and I kept copies of the bank transfers I'd made to cover gaps in her freelance months. Not because I wanted to punish her immediately, but because I needed to rebuild the ledger of truth for myself. She thought an apology wrapped with performing remorse would be enough to return us to the old groove. She didn't understand that I had stopped playing that record. My trust had fractures now. My love had a new instrument, skepticism, and I intended to play it properly. There were days when she doubled down on her performance, cooking meals that tasted like four words and folding in compliments that sought to bend me back into place. She'd say, "You're amazing, babe. You've always been my rock," and then blink as if we'd just agreed on that fact together. Those moments stung because they felt like rehearsals for a life she wanted publicly, privately empty. She would press her forehead to mine and say, "I need you to understand me," then pivot within the same breath till I can't be slowed down. She framed her rise as inevitability and me as a test of her resolve. In the quiet of the night, I watched her craft the version of Simone that climbed and knew that version had little room for me unless I'd been in the background. The red that painted her was not only ambition. It was a kind of practiced ruthlessness, a careful arranging of self that excluded tenderness unless it served a strategy. I try to speak my truth in the small ways men try to recover footing. I tried honesty without dramatics. I said, "If you feel this way, tell me what you need from me, Simone." She looked at me like I'd offered a puzzle with missing pieces and answered with the kind of sentence that haunts. "I need freedom to take what I deserve. I need room to grow without feeling stifled." I asked, "Does that mean I'm the problem?" Her eyes sharpened. "It means I can't be tethered to someone who's not willing to move with me," she said. That was the exact phrasing of a person who had replaced nuance with absolutes. I felt small because love had taught me compromise. She taught me conditional grace. That night she left early, claiming a late client call. The door closed without the usual kiss. It sounded like the end of something that had never been loud enough to start again. Beneath my quiet, I started to make plans that were not about revenge in the cartoonish sense, but about reclaiming dignity and putting the story back in proper order. I spoke with an attorney friend, not because I wanted to punish Simone, but because I wanted to protect the work I had built. I checked our joint finances, moved savings that belonged to me into accounts that only I controlled, and put small protections in place that would prevent a sudden entitlement from swallowing everything I'd worked for. I documented conversations, printed emails, and copied receipts. It felt like armor. I didn't want heat and spectacle. I wanted careful, immovable truth on my side, so that if she tried to gaslight the narrative with tearful speeches about ambition and deserves, I'd still stand tall on the facts. The last scene of this first chapter is not fireworks, but a small, terrible dignity. The next time Simone stood in the kitchen and said, "You're holding me back from everything you deserve," I didn't crumble. I let her speak. I listened to how elegantly she could string sentences that turned blame into aspiration. When she finished, I looked at her and said, calm and precise, "If rising means stepping over the people who love you, maybe what you deserve is not what you need." She blinked, and the practiced mask flinched. For the first time since the promotion, there was a crack. She touched my arm like an apology, but I had already taught myself to feel the weight of touch with a ledger in my head. She thought she had held the moral high ground, because she could name her ambition and tell it like scripture. I thought something else, that sometimes the only rightful revenge a man needs is to stop being the ladder someone uses to climb. The rest I would build in silence. And there is a power in that kind of quiet you don't hear until it's finished. The next few weeks after that night were like living in a film where the soundtrack had been turned off. Simone still moved around the apartment, still wore her perfume, still answered her phone with the same sing-song tone that had once felt like sunlight to me. But underneath it all there was a silence so loud it made my ribs ache. I woke up early just to avoid the awkward breakfast, sitting at the edge of the bed pretending to check emails while she hummed at the mirror, curling her hair for another day of meetings with people who praised her drive. When she spoke to me, it was in the careful, neutral tone of someone avoiding guilt but still enjoying control. She said, "Elijah, don't make this harder than it has to be." And I smiled, because by then I'd stopped needing her permission to breathe. I'd already decided I would no longer defend my worth in a house that thrived on her condescension. I started counting the exits, not from the apartment, but from the emotional prison she had built with compliments and corrections. Simone was smart. Too smart in the way people get when they've mastered charm as a weapon. She understood optics. She started posting more on social media, long captions about women in leadership and ambition, glossy pictures of her at events with executives smiling in perfect lighting. Each post felt like a declaration of independence, disguised as inspiration. Friends congratulated her in the comments, and she'd reply with hearts and hashtags that sounded like sermons. At home, she barely looked at me. When she did, her eyes had that glazed distance of someone trying to remember why they ever shared a life with you. I watched her pretend our marriage was intact in public, because appearances mattered to her brand. I didn't argue. I learned to play my role too. The supportive husband on the outside, the silent architect of change inside. Every time she smiled for the camera, I was busy rewriting the terms of my exit behind the scenes. It started subtly. I began closing small business accounts that had her name on them, transferring documents from our shared drive to my private one. I called clients directly instead of through her email, and I let them know any future contracts would be under my sole company. I sold off the old car she'd insisted we buy to look the part, and replaced it with something simple, functional, paid off in full. She didn't notice at first. Her mind was too busy orbiting her new role, her new friends, her new imagined identity as the woman who had outgrown her husband. Sometimes she'd brag about her coworkers and their big goals, and I'd nod, storing every word. I was no longer reacting emotionally. I was building a record, a map that would lead me out clean while she kept playing at superiority. I was learning that revenge doesn't always look like fire. Sometimes it looks like detachment sharpened to a blade. Simone could sense the shift, though she pretended not to. She started picking small fights just to feel powerful. She'd accuse me of being distant, cold, ungrateful. She'd say, "You used to believe in me, what happened?" And I'd answer, calm and steady, "I still do, just differently." That line always confused her because it wasn't an argument she could win. She needed me angry, reactive, broken. But I'd stopped feeding her that energy. I gave her politeness instead, measured responses, no heat, no begging. She mistook my composure for weakness, but it was the opposite. I'd learned that nothing unnerves a manipulative person like silence they can't control. At night, she'd reach for me in bed, not out of love, but out of habit, and I'd let the distance between us speak louder than any confrontation ever could. One evening she came home late, smelling of expensive whiskey and confidence. She tossed her purse on the couch and said, "You don't wait up for me anymore." I said, "You stopped needing me to." She laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that felt like glass breaking, and said, "You've changed, Elijah." I looked her dead in the eye and said, "You taught me how." That stopped her. She blinked, trying to recalibrate her tone. "I don't want to fight," she said, stepping closer. "You never do," I replied. "You just want to win." For a moment her face softened, and she said, "I'm sorry, babe. I didn't mean any of it. I'm just under pressure." But her voice didn't carry the tremor of truth. It was that same soft, manipulative apology, the kind that sounds tender but is engineered to make you feel guilty for expecting more. I didn't respond. I went to bed. The next morning she tried the opposite approach, sweetness as strategy. She made breakfast, eggs the way I like them, and said, "We should take a trip, just the two of us." I watched her carefully, knowing this was not romance but damage control. She couldn't handle the new version of me, the man she couldn't manipulate with guilt or charm. I said, "A trip sounds nice," but I didn't mean it. I knew it was bait to pull me back into her illusion. She smiled like she'd won something and kissed me on the cheek, then spent the rest of the day on calls about her big project. I watched her through the glass of my new detachment and realized how peaceful it felt not to crave her approval anymore. That's when I knew my comeback wouldn't be loud. It would be precise. My mother used to tell me that when a woman stops respecting your peace, she'll test the boundaries of your dignity just to see if she still owns it. Simone was doing exactly that. She began dropping small reminders of her power, mentioning how her boss had invited her to dinner, how a lot of men found her ambition attractive. She'd say things like, "Not every man can handle a woman like me," and then look at me for reaction. I gave her none. She wanted validation through conflict, but I denied her the currency. Instead, I started going to the gym again, reconnecting with old friends, rebuilding pieces of myself she had slowly eroded. I wasn't chasing revenge yet. I was rebuilding strength. You can't deliver a comeback from weakness. You have to stand tall first. By the second month, her tone had shifted from arrogance to irritation. The more I withdrew, the more she tried to reclaim control. She'd start unnecessary arguments about money, accuse me of being secretive because I stopped updating her on my work. One night she said, "You're hiding something," and I answered, "Only my peace." That line hit her harder than any insult could. She stared at me like she was meeting a stranger. The woman who once prided herself on reading people suddenly couldn't read me. That terrified her. Control was her oxygen. When I stopped giving her emotional fuel, she began to suffocate in her own drama. And that's when I realized revenge wasn't just about payback. It was about letting her live in the vacuum she'd created. A few days later, she tried one last tactic, pity. She came into the living room wearing my old hoodie, eyes soft, voice trembling just enough to sound human again. She said, "Elijah, I don't want to lose you. I just want us to grow." I looked at her and said, "You can't grow in a garden you've already burned." She cried, but even her tears looked rehearsed. I'd seen real grief before, and this wasn't it. This was performance. She said, "I love you," and I almost believed her for a second, until she followed it with, "You just need to understand my dreams." I smiled faintly and said, "I do, Simone. That's why I'm getting out of their way." Her face fell. She didn't know it yet, but those words marked the beginning of my quiet escape. Over the next few weeks, I untangled myself from her completely. I moved my company to a new address, changed passwords, informed clients of my new contact details. Every financial thread that tied us together, I snipped cleanly. I left her name on the lease, took only what I paid for, and made sure the next rent draft would bounce right back to her account. She'd built her world on the illusion of dependence, believing I'd always be the soft place to land. But when I walked out that door, I left her standing on a foundation of her own arrogance. I didn't yell or curse or slam the door. I just left her with silence, the same silence she'd forced me to live in. That's the cruelest revenge, making them live with the echo of their own words. She called me a week later. Her voice was softer now, panicked beneath the tone of control. She said, "Elijah, where are you? We need to talk." I said, "We talked. You told me I was holding you back. I'll let you go." She tried to twist it, crying into the phone, saying you're being cruel. I said, "No, I'm being consistent. She hung up on me, but not before whispering, "You'll regret this." I didn't. In fact, I slept better that night than I had in months. Freedom has a sound. You don't hear it until you stop explaining yourself to someone who never listened. Weeks passed. Word got around that Simone's project had failed. Rumors said she'd clashed with her boss, that her arrogance had finally met its limit. I didn't celebrate out loud. I just kept building quietly. When I saw her name pop up on social media again, the captions were shorter, the smiles tighter. She'd lost the glow that came from being adored. My revenge wasn't dramatic. It was poetic. I'd taken back my peace, my pride, and my independence. And in doing so, I left her to face the one thing she feared most: a world where she couldn't control the narrative. That's when I realized, sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction, it's evolution. And that's exactly what I was becoming. A slow burn that eats you alive without fire. I stopped trying to fix things because every time I did, Jasmine made it feel like I was just patching a wall she was planning to tear down anyway. I would come home from long hours at the auto shop, grease still on my hands, and see her sitting on the couch scrolling through her phone with that distant look that told me her mind was somewhere I wasn't invited. When I'd ask about her day, she'd say, "It was fine," in a tone that froze me out of the house I paid rent for. Our dinners turned into cold silence, and even the air felt heavy between us. I started to wonder when exactly love had turned into a quiet war, where every word I said was a bullet she dodged with sarcasm or silence. I noticed she'd started dressing different too, more stylish, more confident, and more intentional. Her perfume lingered in the air like she was leaving clues, breadcrumbs for me to follow and lose my mind. She'd say things like, "I need to look professional," or "It's for work," but deep down, I knew she was dressing for validation that didn't have my name on it. One night, she came home late again, said there was a team dinner, and when she took off her coat, I saw the faintest smudge of lipstick on her collar. I wanted to ask whose it was, but she looked so calm, so untouchable, that I just swallowed my rage and nodded. Inside, I could feel something in me starting to break, not just from her actions, but from my own silence. My friends told me to walk away, said I was too good for a woman who'd forgotten who stood by her when she had nothing. But pride, mixed with heartbreak, has a strange way of trapping you. I told myself maybe she'd realize what she was doing, maybe she'd come back to her senses. But Jasmine wasn't the kind of woman to turn around. She only looked ahead, even if it meant leaving wreckage behind. One night, I heard her on the phone in the living room whispering, her tone soft, almost playful. When I walked in, she fumbled her words, said, "It's just work," and turned her back on me. That's when I knew she wasn't just slipping away emotionally, she was already gone. The next morning, I found her sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, scrolling through her emails like nothing had happened. I asked, calm as I could, "Are you seeing someone, Jasmine?" She didn't even flinch. She just took another sip and said, "Why do you always need to feel like you're losing something?" That line hit harder than any truth could have. She was gaslighting me right in front of my own reflection. I felt my jaw tighten, but I said nothing. She smiled faintly, almost satisfied with the control she still had. That's when I realized she didn't just want freedom. She wanted to see me crawl for it. The days got darker. I stopped trying to connect. I focused on work, on making enough to cover my side of the bills and keep my peace. I even started saving quietly, transferring small amounts every week into an account she didn't know about. I had no plan yet, but I knew something was coming, a storm I was done standing still for. At night, while she slept soundly beside me, I'd scroll through business forums, researching how to start an auto detailing business. I wanted out, but I didn't want to leave broken. I wanted to walk away with something she couldn't take, my success. One evening, she came home glowing, like she'd just conquered the world. She tossed her purse on the table and said, "They're sending me to Chicago for a conference. All expenses paid." I smiled tightly and said, "Good for you." But she wasn't done. She added, "It's a big deal, Malik. I'm finally getting what I deserve." That word, deserve, made me laugh bitterly. I asked, "And what do I deserve, Jasmine?" She looked at me with cold eyes and said, "You? You deserve someone who wants to live small. I don't." That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, realizing my marriage had already been buried under her ambition. When she left for that conference, I felt peace for the first time in months. The house was quiet, and I could breathe again. I used those days to move fast. I met with a client who'd been asking me to start my own detailing service, and I said yes. I got my business license, designed a simple logo, and found a small lot near downtown to rent. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The same hands that had been dismissed as blue-collar were now building something from scratch. For once, I didn't feel like I was holding anyone back. Jasmine came back from Chicago with a new attitude, the kind that smelled like attention. She was more talkative, but in that condescending way where she made me feel small while pretending to compliment me. "You've been doing fine, huh?" she said one night, scrolling through my phone when she saw a client text me about business. I took the phone from her gently and said, "Yeah, I've been doing real fine." That's when she frowned and said, "Don't start thinking you can compete with me, Malik. We're in different leagues." That line stuck with me like a knife between the ribs. I stopped reacting to her insults. I smiled through them. I started dressing better, driving cleaner, speaking with confidence. She didn't understand it at first, how someone she thought she'd outgrown could start shining right beside her. My business grew faster than I expected. Clients were referring friends, and within a few months, I was making almost twice her salary. I didn't tell her. I wanted her to feel that false superiority a little longer. Revenge, I was learning, doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it walks in quietly wearing success like cologne. One Saturday, she came home early and saw me counting cash on the table, writing out invoices. She froze for a moment and said, "You're really doing this, huh?" I looked up and said, "Yeah." I stopped holding myself back. She laughed, that fake kind of laugh that hides panic, and said, "Don't get carried away, Malik. You'll burn out." I smiled and said, "Funny, I thought that's what you wanted, for me to be ambitious." Her face tightened, and she walked away without another word. Over time, her energy shifted. She started asking about my business more often, pretending to be curious. One night, she even said, "Maybe I could help with your marketing." I laughed and said, "I think I'll be fine on my own." That was the first time she looked genuinely hurt, not because I insulted her, but because she realized I didn't need her anymore. The power had flipped, and she knew it. The woman who once told me I was holding her back was now the one struggling to keep up. A month later, I came home to an empty closet and a folded note on the bed. It said, "I need to find myself." I didn't chase her. I didn't call. I just folded the note back, placed it in the drawer, and smiled. The revenge wasn't in any grand gesture. It was in my peace, my success, my silence. I built everything she thought I couldn't, and I did it without her. She wanted to see me broken, but instead, she gave me the one thing I didn't know I needed, the freedom to become everything I was destined to. When Jasmine left, I thought that was the final chapter, like the book had closed, and I could finally start over without the background noise of her disappointment echoing through every conversation. But life has a funny way of bringing back people right when you found peace. About 6 months after she left, I was sitting in my shop's small office, going through invoices, when I saw her name pop up on my phone. My first instinct was to ignore it, but curiosity, that old familiar poison, made me swipe to answer. Her voice came through soft, almost shaky. She said, "Hey, Malik, it's been a while." I leaned back in my chair and said, "Yeah, it has." She hesitated before adding, "I was just wondering how you've been." I could tell she'd rehearsed that line, the tone too gentle, the guilt too perfectly placed. I didn't give her the satisfaction of warmth. I kept my voice flat, calm, almost bored. "I've been good," I said. "Really good." That seemed to throw her off. She probably expected a man, still licking his wounds, waiting for her return. But I'd long stopped bleeding. I'd healed and grown scar tissue over every scar she'd left. She said she'd been thinking about things, about how she might have been too harsh, how she'd lost sight of what really mattered. I didn't interrupt her. I let her talk. Every apology sounded like it was written for an audience, not for me. When she finally paused, I said, "You sound like someone who's sorry she lost control, not someone who's sorry she caused pain." The silence on the other end of the line was loud enough to make me smirk. A week later, she showed up at my shop unannounced. She was wearing a dress that screamed, "Look at me," the same confident posture she used to wear like armor. But her eyes told a different story this time, pride cracked by regret. "Wow, You've really built something, she said, looking around the lot at my team working on a few luxury cars. I nodded and said, yeah, we're expanding soon. She tried to play impressed, but I could see the envy dancing behind her smile. She walked closer, her perfume hitting me with old memories I didn't want. She said, I'm proud of you, Malik. I looked her in the eye and said, you should be. You were right. I was holding myself back. That line made her blink twice. I knew it cut deep because she had once used those same words to humiliate me. She tried to recover quickly, said, I didn't mean what I said that way. I was just frustrated. I leaned against the car and said, you meant every word, Jasmine. You just didn't expect me to prove you wrong. Her lips parted like she wanted to say something, but nothing came out. That was the moment I realized revenge didn't always need shouting. Sometimes, quiet success was louder than any scream. Over the next few weeks, she started visiting the shop more often. She'd bring coffee or pastries for the team, acting like she was part of something again. My guys noticed, too. One of them even joked, Boss, looks like the missus wants her spot back. I just laughed it off, but deep down, I knew she was testing my boundaries. One afternoon, she stayed behind after closing, leaning on my desk while I finished some paperwork. She said, You've changed, Malik. You're colder. I looked up and said, No, I'm just clearer. She smiled faintly, trying to sound flirtatious, but it landed flat. It didn't take long for her motives to surface. She confessed that the promotion she'd bragged about so much had turned out sour. Apparently, her mentor, the same man I suspected she'd been seeing, had moved on to another rising star. Her words, not mine. She said she'd been overlooked for another role, and that things had gotten complicated. I just nodded slowly and said, Sounds rough. She blinked at me, probably expecting sympathy. But she wasn't going to find that here. Not anymore. The truth was, seeing her like that didn't make me pity her. It made me understand the cycle of her manipulation. Jasmine didn't love people. She loved being validated by them. When the praise stopped, she moved on to the next source. Now that her new chapter had ended, she was circling back to the one man who used to feed her ego with loyalty. But that Malik was gone. I'd buried him next to every apology I'd ever made to her. One evening, she came over to my place, saying she wanted to talk properly. I let her in, mostly because I wanted to see how far she'd go this time. She looked around my apartment, new furniture, clean, peaceful, and said, You've really built a good life for yourself. I nodded, poured myself a drink, and said, Yeah, I've learned peace costs more than pride, but it's worth every penny. She sat down, her tone softening again. I miss us, Malik, she said. We were good together. We just lost track of things. I looked her dead in the eye and said, You didn't lose track. You left the track. Her eyes welled up, the tears glistening like she thought they'd buy her forgiveness. She said, I made mistakes. I just didn't realize how much you meant to me until I didn't have you. I took a sip and said, You didn't lose me, Jasmine. You gambled me. You thought there was something better out there. She reached out to touch my hand, but I pulled away. Don't do that, I said calmly. You're not sorry you hurt me. You're sorry I healed without you. That broke her composure completely. She stood up, pacing, trying to regain control of the scene. Then came the manipulation, her favorite weapon. You're so cold, she said. You've changed so much, it's like you don't even care. I chuckled and said, Oh, I care. Just not about what used to break me. She tried to cry harder, hoping guilt would make me bend. But all I felt was clarity. I realized she was addicted to control, not connection, and I was done being her fix. A few days later, she came by my shop again, dressed sharp, trying to look like the version of herself that used to own every room. She said, I think we should give it another try. I smiled, looked her right in the face, and said, You think I'm still the same man who'd beg for your attention? She tried to interrupt, but I kept going. You left because you thought I was beneath you. Now you're standing in front of me because you finally realized you fell below me. Her eyes went wide, a mix of shock and humiliation. I could see her pride shatter in real time. She whispered, I didn't mean to hurt you that way. I stepped closer and said, You meant every word. But don't worry, I needed it. I needed someone to break me, so I could rebuild stronger. Her lips trembled, but she didn't speak. I continued, You taught me how to value myself by showing me what it feels like to be devalued. So, thank you for that. The look on her face was priceless, The kind of stunned silence that comes when you realize you've lost all the power you once had. Word got around that Jasmine was struggling. She'd left her job, and apparently, the man she'd built her world around had moved on to someone new. People started whispering that she was trying to come back to her roots. Meanwhile, my business hit a new milestone. I opened a second location, hired more staff, and landed a contract with a luxury dealership. Every success felt like another nail in the coffin of the version of me she once pitied. One night, I got a text from her that said, "I really am happy for you." I stared at it for a while before replying, "You should be. You helped create this version of me." Then I turned off my phone and went to bed. That was the real revenge. Not in harsh words, not in anger, but in the peace that comes from knowing you don't owe anyone your pain anymore. She wanted to see me broken, but I turned the heartbreak into empire bricks. Months later, I saw her at a mutual friend's event. She looked smaller, not physically, but emotionally. When our eyes met, she gave a faint smile and said, "You look good, Malik." I nodded and said, "I feel good, Jasmine." That was it. No drama, no closure speech. Just a simple truth that echoed louder than anything she could say. As I walked away, I realized revenge isn't always destruction. Sometimes it's reconstruction. And mine was complete. She once said I was holding her back, but in the end, she became the weight I had to let go of to rise. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.